Alright, Bismillah, alhamdulillah, salatu wassalam ala rasulillahi sallallahu alaihi wasallam, rabbi shrah li sadri wa yassir li amri, wahlul 'uqdatam min lisani yafqahu qawli, rabbi zidni ilma. We're going to go ahead and continue with our study of Muslim history. Today's technically going to be Muslim History 7, which I'll get to, but we didn't quite finish up the Shi'i century last week, so I'm going to quickly run through the Sunni dynasties that existed at this era. And then we're actually going to start the Crusades today. And we will spend the bulk of today actually talking about the Crusades from two narratives. The Christian version of the Crusades, or how the Christian world experienced the Crusades, and how the Muslim world experienced the Crusades. But before we go there, last week, remember, I went through what were the 9 different Khalifas, you could make the argument of, Muslim dynasties that existed during the Divided Caliphate, basically the 10th century, from 850 all the way until 1194. And the only thing that actually unites them afterward will be the Crusades, inshallah. But last week we went over who were the Shi'i dynasties, who are really the major ones that are ruling majority of Muslim lands. They were the Qarmats, the Fatimids, the Hamdanids, and the Buwayhids. Remember I told you 2 of them were Ismaili, they believed in 7 imams, and 2 of them were Ithna Asharis. The Ithna Asharis are the Hamdanids and the Buwayhids. Both of them were actually militarily quite weak compared to the Qarmats and the Fatimids. And all of them actually ruled majority quote-unquote Sunni populations, but they were the ones who were the major rulers of this area that you'll see up there. And then today what we're going to quickly go over is going to be the Sunni dynasties that were there, and why I'm going to rush through them. One reason, because we're going to go over this again once we talk about the post-Crusade world, because they still kind of exist afterward. Be one reason. And the other is because they're about to relatively unite once the big threat of the Crusades actually comes in. But this is, again, Muslims have been victorious for the last 300 years or so. From about 630 till now, they've never really lost lands, they've been gaining land. They've formed into their own kind of unique dynasties all together. And last week we had, remember, the Qarmats, the Fatimids, the 2 Ismailis. Qarmats were the crazy ones that no one claims to be today. This will make the Ismaili lineage of creating Egypt for what it is, that's the Fatimids. The Hamdanids and Buwayhids, even though militarily they are not that significant, they will be extremely significant because majority of what we would consider Iranian or Shi'i culture today actually comes from a combination of these 2 things. Anyway, today we're on the Sunni dynasties, Samanids, Ghaznavids, Seljuks, Ghurids, and Khwarizm Shahs. I'll give you the TLDR of this. The 2 that you really need to focus on will be the Seljuks, because it's the first time that the Turks actually start having some religious ruling power. And then the Khwarizm Shahs, I'm just going to talk about them today, mainly so that you can understand unfortunately they're known for many things, but one of the major things that they're known for is going to be that they are very rude to the messengers of Genghis Khan, and it will lead to the Mongols invading. But that's a whole week away. So, start with the Hamdanids. Generally that same era that we've been talking about, that 10th century. Actually no, we already did Hamdanids. Sorry, we've done these. There we go, we start here. The Sunni dynasties. The Samanids is who we start off with. Relatively small when it comes to kind of like which area they're ruling, but it's Bukhara and Samarkand. Those will be the 2 major areas. How they came to be is they were local heads of villages which had Buddhist ancestors. Were among the first times that Muslims interacted with the Buddhist community of that area. They actually put them right in charge. This was all the way back into the Umayyad era. They didn't want to rock the boat too much. They decided that we're going to pay the jizya tax, so the local infrastructure was cut as it is, and over the generations, what starts to happen is that the area around it starts to convert, and you have actually some of the greatest scholars in Muslim history that come from this part of the world. Like 2 major examples will be Imam Bukhari and Imam Muslim. Both come from this part of the world in Bukhara. Though at this point in history, majority of them would not be speaking their original language of Bukhar, and instead they would actually start speaking Persian. And they move southwest to Iran a little bit, but don't get very far into it. Their coinage is very interesting, that when you look at it, it's bilingual. It mentions the Amir that are local to the area of the other dynasties that exist, but it also recognizes Baghdad as the true Khalifa. So that's interesting on there, and then they have got multiple languages, so it's Farsi and Arabi, not just Arabi in that way. So that's the Samanids in a nutshell. Not terribly important, but a small group saying that what was one of the rules of Muslims is when they entered into a space and there was already working order, they didn't want to disrupt it. They're like doing their own thing as a dynasty. Eventually they became quote unquote Islamicized, but they left them to do their own thing. That's really the legacy of the Samanids. And it'll exist to this day. If you go to like Uzbekistan, if you go to many places within what we would call like Western Europe, the Islam you'll see there is not actually colonized. It's no ruler had to come in and Arabize it and do all of this. They have their own form of practice. Today, for example, if you go and some major figures like Khabib and all of the MMA guys from Dagestan, right? You'll see that they're confident Muslims, but they're not Arab, they're not Turkish. They have none of these influences. They're actually authentically were allowed to stay there because their ancestors actually come from this part of the world. So anyway. That's their second one. I remember, so we're gonna shotgun through this really quickly. Ghaznavids, they are founded by Turks. That's a misnomer. When people think Turks, they think Turkey. No. Turkey is one of the Turkic peoples. There are actually 6 or 4, depending on how you divide them, Turkic peoples. And what does Turk actually mean? If you asked a Turk today, they would say Turk means power. But no, generally speaking, when you ask the Arabs, it would be someone who lives within a tent. They're not city people, they actually live off of the land itself somehow. But there were these nomadic peoples that are considered Turks, and there's many different tribes of them. The Ghaznavids are not the same Turks that would be in current day Turkey. Those would be Oghuz Turks. There's also the Uyghur Turks, the Uyghur Muslims who are in China. They're also considered Turks by that same lineage. And they do share some genetic makeup. That's why if you look at a Uyghur Muslim versus a Han Chinese Muslim, they look very different. Uyghur Muslims look much more closely related to the Oghuz Turks because they actually do share something there, but they're not from the same tribes. Anyone who's a Turkic people, the Mongols, for example, are also Turks, even though we wouldn't identify them as being Turks in today's day and age. They became big enough where we called them their own thing. But anyone who was like this, not focused on agricultural cities, but was traveling from place to place as herding animals, they were considered Turks. Make sense? But the Ghaznavids, they were founded by Turks. They know Mahmud, who is very famously led the campaign into India, and Ghaznavids kind of join in with them. This will become more important when we talk about Muslims in India. The Ghaznavids are going to be the second dynasty that really rules in India. The first one will be the Umayyads, and then after them will be the Ghaznavids. After them will be the Delhi Sultanate. After them will be the Mughals. So that will be when we're talking about India at that time. But where are they located? Generally way far east into India region. That's going to be the Ghaznavids who are there. A little bit about Samanids, not going to go into their a full thing about them. They're going to be very interesting in that it revives the Shamina-i Firdausi, so it's this idea of a lot of Persian literature of like tales of Gilgamesh and stuff. They will translate them into Arabic and into languages that the Muslims can read. And they are very far ahead when it comes to advancing math and science. Al-Bayruni, who's credited as being like the father of algebra, for example, actually comes out of this region in this part of the world. So I'm glossing over it, but why are Ghaznavids important? A lot of these smaller ones, they're very culturally important. That's why it's good that we still appreciate their lineage in terms of where they came from. Militarily, do they do a whole lot outside of India? No, but their legacy still kind of lives on through their many contributions. And when you look at their coinage, that almost looks unheard of. When you look at their coinage, you have like literally a dude and a horse, like floral motifs and stuff. That doesn't look like a typical Muslim coin, but because they were authentically Indian Muslim at this time, all the way back until here. So when anyone tries to say like Islam is not indigenous to India, like how many does 1,500 years make something indigenous or not? Odd kind of question. That Islam didn't colonize India. It's been part of the Indian kind of perspective just as much as most Hindu cultures today would actually be authentically Indian. I always like saying this, you know the definition in I shouldn't say Wikipedia, but in Encyclopedia Britannica, what is the definition of Hinduism? A religion indigenous to India. By that definition, Islam falls under Hinduism. By that definition, of course, that's not how it's colloquially used, But by that definition, Islam will actually be, or Muslims will be Hindu, because why? It's a religion indigenous to that region. So anyway, that's something interesting to think about. Most Navids have kind of that lineage. Another thing that's just kind of interesting, when you look at that statue of a Ghaznavi prince, ethnically and racially, what does that look like? Does it have like a typical Arab look with like a beard or anything? No. Even the eyes. Actually pretty, you can make the argument maybe Indian, maybe even like Asian Indian, like that type of motifs. You'll see that a lot. They actually have a lot of art from this time, and almost everyone will look like this. So, and that would have been Muslim royalty. So just kind of putting out there. Sometimes like the image that's presented of who Muslims are and what Muslim empires look like are very different than what they actually were. These will probably be the most significant one, the Seljuks. Why? Because they will fight the Fatimids back and forth many times, but they are also one of the major Turkic tribes that would be recognizable today. They're nomads after grazing lands, and they go straight to Baghdad in, that's supposed to be 1050. In 1040, they take some lands from the Ghaznavids. There's a whole story about there's a battle over this one princess named Danda Khan. It's kind of romanticized into this thing that like one of the Seljuk rulers fell in love with her, so he fought a whole battle for this woman. It's kind of like a whole Helen of Troy thing, but like a Muslim version of it. If you want to look at it, it's kind of interesting. And then in 1050, they take Baghdad from the Buyids, who were ruling it. Remember, the Buyids or the Buhaywids were the Shi'i group that was there. So they expand quite a bit, but they also shrink right a bit afterward. And then in 1071, they go all the way up in Mesopotamia, all the way to Menzikith, which is like the middle of Mesopotamia, middle of the current day Iraq. And in 1077, probably the biggest city that they build is they rebuild is probably the proper term for it, Konya, which current day Turkey. The famous Konya that's there, Seljuks will be the ones who kind of put that together. Coinage, they had on their coins they always wrote the King of the Kings. So again, they've inherited a lot from Farsi culture as well, this idea of like Gilgamesh's King of Kings kind of narrative. And Dughli Beg and Malik Shah are their two most kind of famous rulers on this. But oftentimes they get romanticized as the saviors of the Sunnah. Because what? They took so much land away from the Shi'i rulers who were there. If you want to read about this, Omid Safi is actually a contemporary scholar from Georgetown. Yeah, he's at Georgetown. Who writes a lot about the Seljuks in a very fair way. One is they did actually return a lot of these lands to regular practice, and they opened the door for Salahuddin al-Ayyubi to unite everyone because they started it first. But they also seem to be much just more ambitious on conquering places and making a name for themselves as much as they did like this. They get presented as like this revival of Sunni Islam. That's not really the case. They seem to be typical rulers that are just kind of going through and making their mark in history. Malik Shah gets put forward as like one of the only religious ones of the group, but Dughli Beg, for example, is just a pure Turkic commander that kind of runs through here. So that happens, simplified genealogy of the great Seljuks. You'll have all the way from Dughli Beg, Malik Shah, all the way down to, or Malik Shah is like over a little bit later here. And then they split off into different groups. There's going to be the Seljuks of Iraq, and there'll be the Seljuks, they'll eventually divide into two major hordes, which is almost what all Turkic people ends up doing. Ghurids of India will be there as well. The Ghurid Empire, again, majority of what we would consider Afghanistan today, Pakistan, and some parts of India. This will really be the cultural origins of Pakistan, come all the way down to this era. That's why they're significant. But again, they start off as Turks from the Afghan mountains, and then piece by piece they take over most of the Muslims in India, replacing the Ghaznavids as the rulers there until the Ghaznavids make a comeback a little bit later. One of the major accomplishments that they have is they build the Delhi Tower. The Delhi Tower was the biggest thing or the tallest thing ever built by human beings up until 1800s when the Eiffel Tower gets built. And it's a miraculous kind of feat of engineering where it's this colloidal structure. Anyone ever been there? It's cool to see because they didn't have iron. They built it out of clay. And how they had to do that is, it's a series of clay that leans in on, you guys don't seem to appreciate this, the physics of this, but it's a structure that like pulls in on itself. That's how you could get it to be that tall, because normally you can't have things that are made out of clay be that tall, it's going to collapse in on itself. But it's a tower that keeps leaning inward, inward, inward to be as tall as it is. So still, and we're talking, when was it built? In the 1100s? And it's the tallest building that human beings build until the 1800s. So when I say Muslims were like at the forefront of these different fields, and why it was called the Golden Age, because architecture, this had never been done before at this scale. So that's just interesting to think about. The Ghurids will be very much seen as a conquering people, and the local Hindus, they rule over them rather than they rule with them. The Ghaznavids, they were a little bit more of the people. The Ghurids came in and ruled. They did. So they destroyed a ton of Hindu symbols, and there was constant destruction that was happening through them, and they also had made no attempt to convert local populations, and actually considered themselves as a higher class from amongst the Indian population. So they never tried to assimilate or have a conversation with the local populations, and this will be talked about all the time. Remember I said like India-Pakistan origins kind of come here? Yeah, it comes all the way from here, because the Ghurids will be culturally where a lot of what quote-unquote Pakistan and Pakistani lineage will trace itself back to. So, you'll see a little bit here. Delhi is a city of cities because anyone who came to Delhi always made their own new construction. There's like forts here, there's this here, and they generally never got destroyed. So you'll find, like, if you go there, it'll be the seat of the Delhi Sultanate eventually, it'll be the seat of the Mughals, it'll be the seat of the Ghaznavids, and the Ghurids and the Ghaznavids after, before them and after them. So it's constantly reconquered, so you'll have like fort after fort and thing after thing kind of built there. Delhi is a very interesting city if you ever get a chance to go. And then this is, now the whole point is that this is that of Islam before the Crusades. All of this was to say, now we will get into the Crusades for the next half hour or so. What part of the world are we talking about? Literally, Muslims for the most part. Everything you see in green has one of those 9 Muslim rulers, or dynasties ruling it. That's the biggest empire the world has ever seen. And it's about to start losing a lot of its land. But till this point, Muslims have never really lost significant land. Any questions before we jump into the Crusades for now? Yes?
So just ruled until like the end of Pakistan, and did they actually go into India?
They did. The reason it's not there is it would have been contested, and they're split off now from the rest of it. What's about to happen with the Crusades is going to affect all of the empires here, but it won't affect Muslims in India. So there will still be Muslims in India, but at that point it will be the Ghurids, and the Ghurids actually separate themselves. Okay, so with that, we will now start the next one, which shall be the Crusades. That's not the right one.
Wait, you didn't go over the last.
Oh, Khwarizm Shahs?
Yeah.
I took them out because we'll cover them mostly when we talk about the Mongols. The only thing you need to know about them is they're what separates China from the Muslim world. So, now we are at the Crusades. It's difficult to divide the Crusades. The Muslim perspective will be that there are 3 main periods of the Crusades. The general Christian narrative is that there are 6 Crusades. And then you can split them up into 12 Crusades if you wanted to go by how many expeditions were made. But depending on who you're talking to, different Crusades kind of change in their number. The Muslim version of this is going to be, I'll give the small one first. 1091 to 1154, expansion and conquering of many Muslim lands. The Muslims are losing land after land after land. That's the first section of it. Then the Muslim reaction will happen, which is from 1144 till 1192. This is the Muslims reclaim land. Which is basically, it's like the Muslim response happens almost 100 years after it starts there. So, and then finally, the last ones will be Latin kings are trying to survive and mark their significance into Muslim lands, will be the last version of how Muslims would describe the Crusades. Remember, Muslims are divided like crazy at this point. So I just gave you that. Another way we can talk about it is invasion of Christians into Muslim lands, Muslim response, and aggression from Europe against Muslim lands. Another way of putting it. What's happening right beforehand is kind of important. The Fatimids are fighting with the Seljuks. The Seljuks come and they take over Fatimid land, and particularly the Seljuks come and they take over Jerusalem. This will create a very odd situation because Christians, mainly Byzantines, have been living within Jerusalem, and so are Jews, for a long period of time. And they've had no real problems with it. But when there's a change of rulership, you'll have two major things occurring. One will be that first, when the Seljuks take over, they want to implement very different policies than the Fatimids that came before them. So it's seen as like suddenly they stop all pilgrimages because they want to do the opposite of what the Fatimids do. And then when the Fatimids reconquer Jerusalem once again, fighting against the Seljuks, kind of taking their land back, you'll have, remember I told you last time, there is this guy who's the founder of the Druze tradition. His name is not coming to me right now, but he destroys the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. And that becomes a rallying cry for the Christians to say, look, Christians are being persecuted in the Holy Land, we're going to go and get them. But that in and of itself is also not completely the story of the Crusades. The story from the point of view of Christians will be the 6 major Crusades. The fall of Jerusalem from Muslim control, so they take back Jerusalem, is Crusade 1. Crusade 2 is, after the loss of Edessa, Saint Bernard calls for a new crusade to be had to reconquer Jerusalem. It doesn't work. This will be the fall of Edessa. Now, the Crusades haven't been, Muslims haven't reconquered Jerusalem just yet, but it'll be trying to expand further. It kind of works, but it doesn't go very far. They don't actually conquer any more lands. The Muslim response now happens in between Crusade 2 and 3. The third crusade is caused by the fall of Jerusalem after Salahuddin took it in 1187. And then you have these 3 who really come in. It'll be 3 kings that are called by the Pope to come and try to reconquer Jerusalem, and it actually leads to a negotiation of Jerusalem that Christians get their rights to actually do their pilgrimage again, which had been stopped for a period of time. So that's there. Crusade number 4, the sack of Constantinople. And the whole fight is over kind of like what's happening with Venice, Italy, the Sicily region. And Constantinople will be, Christians will stop taking Constantinople so seriously because they're like, this is eventually going to be taken by the Muslims. So that's the whole point of the 4th Crusade, is all about Constantinople. 5th and 6th Crusades are interesting. In the 4th Crusade, one of the other major things that they figured out is we're never going to be able to take over Jerusalem. So instead, let's settle with Egypt. So they keep trying to attack Egypt now, rather than trying to get Jerusalem. And the last one is quite literally just 4 trade routes. That's all it is. We're going to get to Cyprus, and we're going to try to command the Mediterranean. It is no longer about the Holy Land at all. But let's go all the way back to now the origins of the Crusades itself. For us to understand this, we have to first understand feudalism. Europe, Muslims, we've been talking about for the past 7 weeks. They were these nomadic people, at least the Arabs were, never united, fighting amongst themselves. Not that the fighting ever stopped, but now they've established themselves into empires that are challenging literally the Byzantine Empire and others. What's been happening in Europe all of this time? There used to be the Western Roman Empire, this massive empire that actually first started off as a pagan empire. Because who are the Romans? They're the ones who defeated the Greeks. And then they convert to Christianity after persecuting it for 200 years or so. They become Christian, but the Roman Empire started falling pretty significantly. Because why? As they were invading Europe, the Germanic tribes did not want to be ruled. So they kept attacking, to the point where the fall of the Western Roman Empire already took place. The Eastern Roman Empire still stands. But there's this massive social divide right now where feudalism is running most of Europe right now. We got a random king that says all of this land is mine, and under me will be a few nobles. And those nobles help me, pay me taxes and stuff to keep making me richer, and they are in charge of all the people who are peasants and serfs. So that's how feudalism works, is there's a king, there's vassals to the king who are lords, and then there's people who are useful to the lords like knights priests, that type of thing. And then the average people have very little wealth and they have no actual social mobility. How you get to be a lord, you can't do anything. You're born into it. And there's this whole thing of like, how were the kings appointed? Because there's the divine right of kings. That even them, it's by lineage. So that's what Europe is kind of going through right now. And they also weren't very good at farming. What I mean by they weren't good at farming is this lasted a few generations. But farmland is starting to become really problematic in Europe because why? As the population keeps increasing, there's been no real innovation. And part of that has to do with, is the church known for like allowing scientific progress to take place? Like, hey, I have a new idea, can we implement this? No, that's not really what's happening. That's why we call it like the Dark Ages, where Thomas Hobbes calls it that life is nasty, brutish, and short. So there's got to be social upheaval, but not only that, what was sustaining them so far was that they had this giant empire that, and what do empires do? Anything from the corners of the empire, you have to keep expanding because you're feeding the people in the middle. But the Roman Empire has fallen on the west, and on the east, they're losing lands from the Byzantines, so there's not wealth coming in anymore. There's actually, they're becoming poorer and poorer. So there's a social problem here. There was already lack of social mobility. There's not much progress that's to be had, and now we have a population that's about to overrun overrun the working systems that exist. So Pope Urban II sees this as a way to now reunite somehow this group. Because what is he dealing with? He has a bunch of people from Europe coming into the Byzantine Empire, and they have no way of actually feeding them or doing anything. And you have also a theological divide, that the Western Roman Empire has a pope, and the Eastern Roman Empire, the Byzantine Orthodox community, has a pope. So suddenly you have this idea that let's unite now, Pope Gregory and Pope Urban II, they declare this way as a way of uniting our churches together. What we will do is we will conquer lands from the Muslims. And you can make an argument that this is a theological move, because why? We need to reconquer Jerusalem. But what they're actually trying to do is, when you look historically, it wasn't the rich people who were going for the Crusades, it was the poor people who would like sell off everything, and the Western Roman Empire would literally write them indulgences, meaning if you go and do this, your debt to the king will be forgiven. Go and conquer land, because we don't know what to really do with you. So they start putting this together, and people start selling all of what they own in order to just buy armaments. Who gets rich from it? The Byzantine Empire. And the Western Roman Empire. It's like an unholy alliance. What do they get out of it? All these people that we don't know what to do with are causing trouble, let's send them off elsewhere. And all in the claim of what? The Holy Land. And there was no theology of Christian war yet. It doesn't exist. There's a concept of jihad in the Islamic tradition that did not exist within Christianity. But they're like, let's call it a pilgrimage war. That's where the idea of the crusade came in. Was it a pilgrimage or was it war? This idea, go on pilgrimage, and anyone who stops you from going on pilgrimage, go ahead and get them. And these are poor people who are not very educated. So oftentimes, as they're going through, they're actually causing a lot of mayhem. The Crusaders have a terrible legacy in local European populations, as when a Crusader comes in, they're just gonna like hide your kids, hide your wife, because they're like going crazy and doing crazy things. And actually, as they're going through, part of what they do is they massacre any Jew that they see. Because what? They're the ones who killed Jesus. So the Crusades have a pretty terrible legacy. But they're led by Godfrey in Belgium, Balian. Killing Jews was part of one of the main objectives, and they start going in masses, and the Muslims had never actually faced an army like this before. In 1097, they easily come in and take Iznik. Iznik will be like, or Turkey is at the edges of the Muslim rule at this point. In 1098, they take Edessa, getting closer and closer to what would be where we would call the heart of where the Muslims are right now: Jerusalem, Baghdad, Damascus, Syria, that whole area. Then in Antioch, they claim to find the cross of Jesus Christ. Complete fallacy. That wasn't the case. And there's a famous battle in which someone like dug up a random spear and said, "This was the spear that they stabbed Jesus with," and like they unite a bunch of people together to like continue going forward. But there is this religious fervor behind it. But what is it actually? It's actually a means of addressing all of these social problems that exist within Europe. Like send your poor people out to go, and it's kind of like when we're having social upheaval, go and kill those Muslims in the other part of the world. And who gets rich as a result of it? Weapons manufacturing companies. This doesn't sound familiar at all. And you're actually going because they hate our freedom, but the real reason was oil. Huh. Okay, sorry. The world has not changed much, unfortunately. But anyway, they go ahead and do this, and they get all the way up to, in 1099, taking Jerusalem. And when I say this is the representative of what happened here, it was the single bloodiest day in history, arguably, till World War II. Not just the city, but they killed anyone who was in there. Remember I said Muslims weren't the only ones living in Jerusalem. Who was living in Jerusalem? Muslims never had a policy of not allowing Jews and Christians to live in Jerusalem. Actually, there's a very famous incident that Umar ibn Khattab, once he takes over Jerusalem, he personally finances for 300 Jewish families to return to Jerusalem. Why? Because they complained and they said the Christians that ruled here took our lands, so Umar gives them back their lands. He pays for 300 Jewish families to move to Jerusalem. So they were there, but they killed everyone, and we'll talk about how significant that is. They killed anything that moved. No animal was left alive in Jerusalem. They eradicate all the masajid, Qur'ans, everything. Aqsa gets turned into a church. And I'll talk about how significant that was in the next slide, inshallah. What is the result of this? No major important Muslim cities are taken, it's just the outskirts, other than Jerusalem, of course. And all of these places are now completely kind of like ripped of their Muslim lineage. And when I say there was a massacre of Jerusalem, this is from Wikipedia. I didn't edit this. I'm going to just read it straight out to you. On 15th of July, 1099, the Crusaders made their way into the city through the Tower of David and began massacring large numbers of inhabitants, Muslims and Jews alike. The Fatimid, actually this is interesting that it's from a non-Muslim source. Oh no, this is by a Muslim source, the next one will be from a non-Muslim source. The Fatimid governor of the city, Iftikhar ad-Dawla, managed to escape. According to eyewitnesses' accounts, the streets of Jerusalem were filled with blood. How many people were killed is a matter of debate, with the figure well over 100,000 given by the Muslim historian Ibn al-Athar. So that's one. Many Muslims sought shelter in the Aqsa Mosque, thinking that masajid are safe places. The Dome of the Rock and the Temple Mount area. According to, this is now a French source, Gesta Francorum, speaking only of the Temple Mount area, our men were killing and slaying. This is a Crusader source. Our men were killing and slaying even the temple to the Temple of Solomon, where the slaughter was so great that our men waded in blood up to their ankles. According to Raymond of Aguilar's, also writing solely, primary sources, of the Temple Mount area, in the temple and the porch of Solomon men rode in blood up to their knees and bridle reins. That's how much blood was kind of flowing as a result of this. Writing about the Temple Mount area alone, Fulchar of Chartres, another crusader, who was not an eyewitness of the Jerusalem siege, because he had stayed with Baldwin of Abassids. In this temple, 10,000 were killed. Indeed, if you had been there, you would have seen our feet covered to our ankles with the blood of the slain. What more shall I relate? None of them were left alive, neither women nor children were spared. Every living soul was killed when Jerusalem was taken. We're going to talk about when Muslims retake Jerusalem in a little bit. Jews had fought side by side with Muslim soldiers to defend the city, and the Crusaders breached the outer walls. The Jews of the city retreated to their synagogue to prepare for death. According to the Muslim chronicles of Al-Qala'nisi, the Jews assembled in their synagogue, and the Franks burned it over their heads. They were burned alive in the actual synagogue when Jerusalem was taken. This is how Jerusalem was taken. This was the fervor of the Crusades. So what ends up happening, there were two major orders of the First Crusade, which was the monastic knights. They wanted to protect the Christians from coming to the Holy Land. They seem to be doing this from a religious type of perspective. Knights of St. John, origin of religious tourism, hospitals of Jerusalem are built from here. And then there's the other ones, which will be the more creepy people. The Order of the Templars. They're gods, they call themselves God's warriors, the elite military forces of Christianity. Well organized, by the way, there's our Secretary of War currently has a tattoo of the Knights Templars on him.
Kill him. I didn't mean that.
We are all peaceful, we don't advocate for any terrible things.
I take it back, I take it back.
Okay. Well organized under order in the Order of the West, branches all around Europe, sending funds from the Crusaders. There's many legends surrounding them, even like the idea of the curse of the Templars. They're looking for the Holy Grail. There's all this like creepy stuff that also takes place with them. But they're there. Unique and important architecture. They, interestingly enough, really love the Dome of the Rock. They think it has some like sacred powers with it because of the Temple of Solomon being associated with it. which is probably a historical fallacy on their end, that they thought that the Dome of the Rock, because it looks so amazing, was the Temple of Solomon, but the Dome of the Rock was made by Abd al-Malik. It's not actually the Temple of Suleiman, but anyway, they make it their temple. Chevaliers controls this valley for a long period of time, and then they also set up like this whole tunnel system underneath. Aqsa is actually made by the Knights Templars because they have all this like creepy stuff going through there. And so what they do is they occupy Jerusalem. This would be the first major occupation of Jerusalem, at least from the Muslim perspective. And well, interestingly enough, as they occupy this area of Palestine, as we call it, they get seduced by the quality and riches of Muslim life. They go there and they're like, you know, these Muslims have something. They bathe all the time. And yes, I'll read some things like with Crusaders. They saw the Muslims like, is this the kingdom of heaven? Because they saw how the Muslims were living. Like, they use perfume because they're coming from what? Feudalism, where you bathe once a year, where you don't put perfume on yourself. You know why? Because you're taking away God's essence on you. So they see these Muslims bathing all the time. They see them shaving. There's a really interesting primary source in which you have this crusader who has conquered over this land or been given this land, and he sees his Muslim servants, and he sees him raise his arm, and the Muslim guy had shaved armpits. He's like, "What? How did you do that?" And he's just like, "We all do this." Like a religion kind of commands us to do this. He goes, "Do this to me," and he has it done to him, and then he has him do this to his wife as well, and like. Yeah, it's the whole thing. They even things like shaving private parts. Church called them pagans, but when they looked at how they were living, they're like, these people have much finer living. That's why they called it a kingdom of heaven, because what? It literally looked like it was heaven that the Muslims were living in, because we had hygiene and culture and art and other things like that. But the big question will be, why was it so easy to take over Jerusalem? Because why? 3 Muslim powers were fighting amongst each other for the last 50, 60 years. And no one in the beginning, when the Crusades were coming, took them seriously. They were just like, they're coming? All right, let them come. Because why? Muslims had never lost land before. So they didn't actually take them too seriously. And as they come in, the other thing will be sugar becomes their biggest harvest. Muslims were harvesting sugar as well, but when they come in, they will use it to actually extort sugar from the land and take it elsewhere. We'll talk about that later as the origins of slavery in Europe is very different than the origins of slavery in the other places, but I'll talk about that later. This is the general route that they took. Again, coming from what we would call Turkey, down through Syria, and up until Jerusalem. And then they try to get to Egypt, but they don't really get there. And Crusade 2 now. So that's Crusade 1, Jerusalem has fallen. Crusade 2, they try to go further. Led by Conrad II and Louis VII? I don't know Roman numerals that well. Basically, the origins of Germany and France, yeah.
So this is Crusade 2 according to the Christian perspective.
Again, the Christian perspective, yeah. Causes no real gain for the Christians, but it causes the Arabs to get united. This is going to be a fact of history that's going to bother a lot of Muslims. When Jerusalem falls, one, they don't leave anyone alive. So you have to wait until information kind of trickles through of what happens, and they have to go through it through Crusader sources. But the other is, Muslims don't seem to respond right away. But there's now a threat. The Crusades try to occupy Damascus, and they fight against and try to get to Damascus in 1148. Damascus, there were close to 500,000 to 700,000 Muslims, people living in Damascus. Suddenly, there was a huge Muslim uproar that a city like Damascus could be conquered. And so Muslims react to Damascus, the Crusaders come to Damascus, not necessarily to them coming to Jerusalem. Is that to say that Jerusalem was not important? No, Jerusalem was important, but Jerusalem, it was understood that they came there. When they're coming for Damascus, now they're coming to actually destroy the Muslims in totality, so suddenly there's an existential threat. They're not just coming to take over a city, but it's going to be now we have to respond. So this is the route that they're taking. Again, they've been coming down the coast, and Muslims are like, all right, that's all right, that's all right, that's all right. Not that's all right, but they're not doing anything. But once they start going inward to Damascus, they're like, they're not here just trying to control their own major cities. They're going after the cities that we live in, that we've been building up. That's when there's going to be a sudden response. And now the Muslim reaction to Crusades 1 and 2. In Aleppo, with the Zangid dynasty from 1127 to 1193. Why is it called Zangid? Because Nuruddin az-Zangi is what the dynasty really comes from, who is Salahuddin's uncle. Imad-ad-Din Zengi is a Turkish slave son who inherits the entirety of the Seljuk Empire. The Muslims start adopting a interesting thing. They recognize that the Crusades are a threat that they've never faced before. They can't have the old guard being the one who defends them. So anyone who is militarily successful will be the one who is going to be recognized, who can defend the Muslim lands. So it's actually a Turkish slave's son who's recognized and trained in the military arts. Basically, he's understood to be extremely good general. He takes over the entirety of the dynasty. He expands his rule first from those that were called Abassids, the uncles of power, and then in 1144 he starts fighting the Crusaders one city after the next. Takes Edessa, and that's, remember how he said the Second Crusade was kind of a response to that. He has some success, but then a little bit after him, the son of Imad is Nur ad-Din Zangdi, who's going to be the uncle again of Salahuddin al-Ayyubi, who most of us will know of. He appoints his rep Shirkuh in Cairo, and he starts really forming things together. I'm not going to talk about this militarily too much because it's going to get too much into local politics, or in current day politics. But something that Nuruddin always said is, the ruler, you cannot rule Palestine unless you rule Egypt and Syria. That strategically, Egypt and Syria have to be united for Palestine to be safe. So he doesn't actually go for Palestine right away. Nuruddin first decides, we need to take Egypt and we need to control all of Syria. Later we'll get to Palestine. Interesting. So, but who's ruling those two places? Syria, like 3 different groups are there. You have the Buwayhids, you have the Samanids, you have the Seljuks to a certain extent. Egypt, who's there? The Fatimids are there. So who does he have to first unite? The Muslims. Because why? Jerusalem is controlled by the Crusaders. But we're going to make sure that Syria and Egypt are in agreement. That's why today, when we're talking about safety and security and control of Palestine, that might be actually what needs to be done first, is we need to first free Syria and we need to first free Egypt. Until that's done, there's going to be no security, unfortunately, in Palestine. But anyway, so he sends his people back to, so what does he first do? He appoints his rep Shirkuh in Cairo, and he takes Damascus from the local rulers from the Seljuks. So he first conquers, Shirkuh conquers Cairo, and he conquers from the Seljuks. Now that he has both Egypt and Syria, he sends his people into Fatimid Cairo and it's really beautiful how he takes over Fatimid Cairo. He actually appeals to the people directly. What have your Fatimid rulers done for you? They built you stuff, right? But guess what happened under their watch? Jerusalem was taken. 80,000 Muslims, 20,000 Jews were killed. This happened, and the people actually just kick out the Fatimid rulers. They're like, alright, no, we're threatened, and it's like, they're coming for you next. Where do you think the Crusaders are going to go after this? They're going to go into Egypt. So he takes over Egypt, and he takes over Syria, and that's what opens the door to Salahuddin coming into power next. Salahuddin inherits from his uncle, Nuruddin, and he goes up from Egypt and gets rid of the Ismaili rulers who are there. There's a whole other thing about the assassins who become the killers of Salahuddin, the Hashashin. The whole game Assassin's Creed is based off of the Hashashin. They were the ones who actually killed Salahuddin. But anyway, that will be a whole other thing, because he put the Fatimids into hiding as a result of this, because the people turned against them. Some of the most famous battles in history take place between Muslims and Christians here. The Battle of Hattin next to the Tiberias River. Salahuddin does something interesting. He first marches out towards them, and one of the things he knows is they claim to have discovered the cross of Jesus. Remember, like 50 years ago, they discovered the cross of Jesus. And he's like, okay. So the main Crusader army, he taunts them and he runs into the desert. And they follow him. And he knows they have this religious fervor to be like, the cross of Jesus can never be destroyed. So he's like, alright, follow me into the desert. Follows them into the desert. He surrounds them on all sides and refuses to give them any water. Like, they have no access to water. They're all there, decked out in their armor, with this massive 100,000 person army, and he never has to fight. Because why? He comes back in, and he starts then sending his emissaries, go give them some water, and say you can have water if you don't fight. The army starts completely breaking ranks, takes over the major army of the Christians. If you've seen the movie Kingdom of Heaven, it doesn't do justice to that battle. Remember that battle in which they all ride out to chase Salah ad-Din's army? And then what happens to that army? The army just disintegrates. What actually happens is Salah ad-Din comes back and actually gives them water. So interesting, he doesn't do that to the majority of the army, he lets them surrender, except Muslims have no mercy for the Templars. Because why? What had happened also is, a person, I forgot his name, Boolean? He was that big fat guy with the red beard in the Kingdom of Heaven. But he kills the 20,000 Hujjaj who were going towards Hajj. And the person who had that ordered at Karak. Salah ad-Din has no mercy for them, and he has them all killed. He never lets the Knights Templar go whenever he finds them anywhere. Anyway, he takes over a bunch of these strongholds all around the city, all across Palestine, from bottom to top. Karak, Akko, Beirut, Akshalem, all in the same year. And all of these are the only cities that resist him is actually Tripoli and Antioch. And the main thing is, he doesn't massacre other than the Knights Templar, that's there, and people are allowed to leave. He said, whatever you need, I will allow you to leave. And the biggest thing ends up happening is when he takes over Jerusalem. I'll talk about that in a second. Okay, so he takes over all of the major strongholds around Jerusalem, across Palestine. Then, when it comes to taking Jerusalem, he sieges the city. The siege lasts for about a week. And the negotiator comes out and says that he will burn the whole city to the ground. And Salah ad-Din says to him that actually, your city, I don't care about your people. Not that I don't care about them, it means I don't care about killing your people. I will provide safe passage for every single person who wants to leave. I will personally pay for them to end up at a port that returns them to Christian lands. And they can take with them whatever their animal can keep with. Like whatever animal they want to have, if they want to take their belongings, let them take their belongings, that's okay with me. Just surrender the city to me. Now the person's like, when the Christians took the city, we killed every single person. 100,000 people died. And Salah ad-Din says, I am not those men. That's not me. I'm Salah ad-Din, the representative of Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And kind of lets them go. One of the things that this does is, we're going to see the rest of the Crusades will not be about Jerusalem anymore. There'll be a slight attempt, but people are like, dude, Jerusalem is better. In whose hands is Jerusalem better off? Being in Muslim hands. So, anyway, that's their Bazrat to leave or buy their freedom, and he doesn't massacre them. Other than, again, he's pretty rude to the Knights Templars. And there's a saying, this isn't literally true, but as Salah ad-Din entered back into Bayt al-Maqdis, I'll get to it in a second, he's carrying with him two books. He has the Quran in one hand, and he has the Ihya Ulumuddin in the other. Why this is important is, Muslims for a period of almost, not 100 years, like 80 years, Masjid al-Aqsa turns into a church. And Muslims were like, what do we do? And that's where you'll have major scholars like Imam Ghazali, who will produce works motivating young people to take their deen seriously and come up with a new, that's why it's called the revival of the Islamic sciences. Like all of this, the works of all of these different scholars, how the average people use them to motivate them to actuate change in the world around them. That's the whole idea of why the Ihya is so monumental in that way. That a generation was raised reading this that leads to someone like Salah ad-Din al-Ayyubi. He didn't come out of a vacuum. He came out of this desperation, and also the accomplishment of 200 years of scholarship suddenly will produce someone like Salah ad-Din who has military tactics that had not been seen. To this day, when people want to study military tactics, how a general is supposed to behave, they will see what Salah ad-Din does. But on the other hand, you can also see ethics to such a high extent that he had the opportunity of taking revenge, doing all of these things, but he doesn't. Each time he seems to choose mercy onto it. So it's this beautiful kind of combination of it. And you could also make the argument that who was more significant than Salah ad-Din is probably Nuruddin, his uncle. It was probably Imaduddin, his grandfather. But why is Salah ad-Din given it? Because he steps on the shoulders of giants in a good way to produce someone like him that causes such a significant act of mercy and justice that's really been produced. So I'm going to stop here for a second. Yes?
This isn't Salah ad-Din al-Ayyubi, right?
This is Salah ad-Din al-Ayyubi.
This is,
yeah.
okay.
Yeah. Yes?
What would happen to the Christians that didn't leave?
They were allowed to stay.
And nothing would happen to them?
So it was mainly the royal family and others who would leave, but Salah ad-Din actually kept it open. And he re-invites, another thing, he does what Umar ibn Khattab did before him. He pays for Jews to come back into Jerusalem, because why? What did the Crusaders also do? they massacred all the Jews in Jerusalem. So Salahuddin pays for Jewish families to move back into Jerusalem.
Did Christians leave only on the premise of fear of what would happen to them if they stayed?
Probably. And because majority of them had only come in.
Recently.
So the way to put this is, Byzantine Christians already existed within Muslim lands. Roman Christians, like the Western Roman Empire, they didn't. They were like Franks, Germans, Prussians, all of these different groups. Those would be the ones that left back to their homelands. Yes?
Is the flag in the background accurate?
Kind of. That would have been actually the Seljuk flag, but I don't know if it would have been used at that time or not.
Is he Seljuk?
No, he is Kurdish by ethnicity, but he would have already conquered the Seljuks. He starts his own dynasty known as the Ayyubids, but he would be his own thing. He actually, this is something that's beautiful, is when do Muslims unite? When we're threatened. At least we're supposed to. That these random nationalistic things like, where are you from, where's this, all that kind of starts falling by the wayside. He's by definition a Zengid, but that doesn't mean a whole lot to almost anyone. That's how we would classify it now. It is 6:30. I'll go maybe a quick summary of the next one or two crusades, and then we'll break for Maghrib, inshallah. Any other questions or comments? But what I want us to focus on is we saw a lot of division, right? Suddenly you see, when did Muslims unify? When there was a threat, and also suddenly you have 200 years of scholarship coming together to motivate people to actually effectuate change in the world around them. So like, what were they doing all this time? All of those advancements that are happening, that's why Ghazali is considered such an, and we're not going to talk about Muslim scholars all that much in this history class because we're talking about political history. But why is Imam Ghazali called Hujjat al-Islam? Is because this 200 years of Muslim scholarship producing works of tafsir, of hadith, of fiqh, all of it is kind of coming together and producing individuals now. That's why Salahuddin becomes almost like this emblematic figure as a result of that. Who's respected historically regardless of which culture you're coming from. Yeah?
Question before you move on to the next crusades. What were you talking about the assassins?
The Hashashin.
Yeah, who's that?
So Salahuddin, one of the things that he does is he, not Salahuddin, his uncle, Nuruddin, sends his major general Shirkuh to Cairo to de-seat the Fatimid rulers. The Fatimids are not happy with it at all. So what they do is they go into hiding and they start doing political assassinations as like guerrilla warfare. And they actually end up eventually assassinating Salahuddin, but they will be a force from here on. The Hashashin, and that's actually where the word assassin comes from, is these Ismaili, like they follow a small sect of Islam which is different than everyone else, and they have their own rules of what they do, but they hide in the shadows and they poison and they kill in the dark and all that type of stuff. So that's, they go into hiding basically.
And they plot for like revenge and eventually get it.
Yeah, they plot for revenge and political control because they want to rule again, but they never really get to. Yes?
They used to get high because I heard that the reason why they call it hashish is because they would smoke.
Yeah. It wouldn't have been weed. It would have been many types of psychedelics in which they would see visions that would tell them what to do next.
What?
Yeah, I don't know. History's weird. My job to tell you. I don't know. So yeah, who knows what they were seeing? I have no idea. Then we can get into conspiracy theories of like, what are psychedelics other than like gins? No, okay. Crusade 3, a response to now Jerusalem falling. It's the last conquest where we conquer Jerusalem, but this fails pretty miserably, and you'll see why. Richard Lionheart, who's actually a pretty cool figure, comes from England. He actually doesn't care about Jerusalem all that much. He's interested in Cyprus because he sees this as like a road to controlling the Mediterranean. Philip II never actually makes it to Jerusalem. He just sees how Jerusalem is being ruled, and he just kind of, like I said, they go there and they're like, what are we fighting this for? And the funniest one, we don't have much story about Barbosa, but he also doesn't make it really far. Frederick from the Holy Roman Empire. He drowns as soon as he leaves his port exit because he loaded too much on his boat and he couldn't swim. So as you can see, Actually, they accomplished one thing. The English do occupy Cyprus as like a seat of control. And interesting enough, as Salahuddin sees all of this is happening, he's now the ruler, the de facto ruler after this, and he's already started the Ayyubid dynasty. We'll talk about them a little bit later. But he allows the Christians to remake their pilgrimage. So there are already Christians there, but he didn't allow people to come in because you don't know what they're coming in for. As soon as this has happened, are they coming in for revenge or whatever? He sees that, okay, if that's the case, I'll allow you to do your pilgrimage. So suddenly any religious claim to Jerusalem goes by the wayside. You're like, we're going so we can do pilgrimage to, you can come in. Like, oh. Just don't kill anyone. You can go do your thing. It's like, oh. Do you see why, like, the slightest setbacks, they're like, alright. It's like, there's no religious steam anymore as to how to do this. So one of the ways I could almost describe the Crusades is like, let's take it over. They take it over and they do like massive venting of frustration of like generations of oppression that we've been under. And then they go and take over and then they get kicked out. And like, oh, we're still angry. What are you angry about? You guys have a point. It's one way of describing it. The Ayyubids are the dynasty of Salahuddin. It's a response to Crusade 3, not really, but it's happening simultaneously at the same time. He now controls Syria, Hijaz, and Egypt. This hasn't happened since the beginning of the Abbasid Empire. All of these three have been under one leadership. So he technically wasn't the first Ayyubid because he was a Zangid, but he names himself Al-Ayyubi, so he becomes that way. But it's actually Al-Adil As-Sayfuddin, the brother of Salahuddin, who ends up being the first of the Ayyubids, and then Al-Kamil Muhammad will be a response to the Fourth Crusade, which we'll get into. But he loses to chess to Frederick II, and it's actually really interesting. This is the whole idea of he gets more rights for pilgrims in Jerusalem to not just visit there, but actually live there and establish permanent hospitals and like places there. And it's decided over a chess match. I want you to think about how the Crusades evolved.
So
It went from massacre to like they're talking, and they're like, you know what? This is almost turning into a trade negotiation. Let's see who's more tactical. Whoever's more tactical ends up actually deciding what the policy will be. Oh, interesting. And then so he gets passage not just to Jerusalem, but all the way to Egypt. From Egypt to Jerusalem. So they open up like many hubs of it. So Salahuddin already allowed pilgrims to come in as individuals. He's like, let me have whole country trade routes that go into Jerusalem itself. And he allows that. And as Salih al-Ayyub, what do you call it? Louis IX is a saint who attacks Egypt under his watch. That ends up happening, but that's not out of trying to conquer Jerusalem anymore. They just want the riches that exist within Egypt. Be able to reconquer Alexandria for the most part. And finally, what happens? We won't go over Crusade 4, so much 4 and 5 today, 4, 5, and 6. But Christian world leaves Europe. This is what the end result of the Crusades really were. That they actually realized that we don't have to just stay here. They established trade routes all throughout here. The argument that sometimes is put forward that the Crusades are a response to Muslims invading Christian lands is nonsensical. You know why? How long ago did Muslims conquer the majority of these Christian lands? 250 years ago. So you're telling me it took 15 generations? Like, whatever, 10 generations, 15 generations for them to respond? No. What was it? It was actually the crumbling situation of Europe was unbearable, so to vent out its frustrations and let it out on the Muslim world. And who benefited as a result of it was actually the Christian world. Because they established ties with the Muslims, and that actually allowed for a lot of rich learning to take place. Cleanliness, Muslim economics, Muslim culture and philosophy gets exported back into Europe, because it didn't exist for a long time there. I'm not going to talk about this as much, but we'll just, I'll do that next time. Where are we? I have to just quote some of these. These are from Osama ibn Munqid's A Muslim View of the Crusaders. There was a respected Frankish knight who had come from their country just to go on pilgrimage and then return home. He said to me, "My brother, I am leaving for my country. I want to send your son with me to my country where he can observe the knights and acquire reason and chivalry. When he returns, he will be like a truly rational man." That's what he says. And now, continuing forward, this is now what his son sees. So his son is the one who kind of went off. For the woman, I prescribed a special diet, this is what this now Muslim man is saying, and increased the wetness of her humors. Then a Frankish physicians came in to them and said, this fellow doesn't know how to treat them, so he took a razor and made a cut in her head the shape of a cross. Then he peeled back her skin so that the skull was exposed and rubbed it with salt. The woman died instantly. What is he saying? Just like, dude, I went to observe Frankish customs, and oh my gosh, are they barbaric. Another one. One day, this is from newly Franks that kind of arrived. One day I went to the little mosque, recited the, actually Muslim is saying this. One day I went to the little mosque, recited the opening formula, God is great, and stood up in prayer. At this point, one of the Franks rushed at me and grabbed me and turned my face towards the east, saying, pray like this. So the Templars came in again, grabbed him, and threw him out. So weird kind of associations that they're having. Is this the one? Okay, here's the one. We came into the home of one of the old knights who came out in one of the first expeditions of the Franks. He presented a very fine table with food that was extremely clean and delicious. But seeing me holding back from eating, he said, eat and be of good cheer, for I don't eat Frankish food anymore. I have Egyptian cooking women and never ate anything except for what they cook. What do? They kind of adopted full-on like this idea of like what Muslim cultures really look like. And you see narration after narration. I literally asked ChatGPT, tell me a few quotations of conversations between Crusaders and Muslims from the earlier sources that we have. The themes that it came up with, Osama bin Mukhli, admiration or imitation of Muslim cleanliness. What was the source? Fulcher of Chartres, that way. Adoption of bathing culture. Ibn Jubair, I've actually read this one before. That they were enthralled by how the Muslims are so clean. How do you stay clean? So it's like, well, we're obligated to take a bath at least once a week, and we do it more often than we can. Who's describing this? William of Tyre. Recognition of Muslim civility, all throughout Kitab al-Ittiba, in later things like Muslims are described as clean, reasonable, orderly, and setting a civilizational standard. And they take this back with them to Europe. What are the major effects that come in out of it? They come in contact with advanced Muslim scholarship in medicine, astronomy, mathematics, philosophy, Arabic translations of Greek works that had been forgotten, like Aristotle, Galen, Euclid, and it actually sparked the Renaissance as a result of it. Economics, they finally moved out of Europe and they have Mediterranean trade routes that connect to the Islamic world. European cities like Venice, Pisa, and Genoa become rich through trades of spice, textiles, and knowledge, and again, urban growth is put forward, and technological and cultural transfer. Europe adopted or improved upon technologies such as papermaking, navigation tools, military engineering from the Muslim world. So again, intellectual pursuits also kind of going all over. Where? Oh yeah, I didn't include it. Next time I'll include it. But there's like this very funny story of even the simple things like shaving. The Crusaders come across it, like, what on earth? These Muslims are living in heaven. And they start abandoning this idea. Like, we were going to what? For the afterlife, to avoid hell, for indulgences. We came here and we found heaven itself. So, what was the major effect of the Crusades, and we'll focus on this much more next week, is Europe becomes civilized. The European national state is actually owed to interactions with the Muslim world. Because what happens? The fall in the Roman Empire, a bunch of random kings and nobles are ruling, things of the feudalism is taking place, and they start seeing Muslims have a different way. They have a way of actually social mobility taking place, that average people have cleanliness, and there's a whole system of what guilds being formed where average Muslims can pick up a skill and actually empower their family. All of these type of things are actually being imported into Europe, and it will lead to Europe breaking from the shackles of the Dark Ages. One of the major kind of effects of it. What I want us to focus on from the Muslim side is, Muslims, they got militarily destroyed, came back together, conquered, but then once they conquered, they didn't go in a mastering spree back into Europe. Like, you guys go do your own thing, we're fine. Like, we'll stay here. And we'll find a very different form of this happens when the Mongols invade, but that'll be 2 weeks, inshallah. With that, we're doing way too much. Any questions, comments? Yes?
Where does the laqab al-Ayyubi come from?
Al-Ayyubi?
Yeah.
That's a good question. I believe it goes back to the Sahaba, Abu Ayyub it goes to one of the Sahaba. I forgot who, but it goes back that way. But I'm gonna have to look it up. Yeah, Abu Ayyub. Abu Ayyub al-Ansari. That's why his name came up. But that'll be the laqab that's kind of adopted because he was the first one to go into Christian lands. Where the Byzantine Empire, he was like a major conqueror in that way. So Salahuddin will take that up as the one who conquered, just like Ayyub before him. It's not the Prophet Ayyub. My son's name is Ayyub. His nickname is Ayyubi. Yeah. Anyone else? Yes?
Was there any benefit of the Crusades on the Muslim Empire?
Yeah, it united them. They were fighting amongst themselves, and suddenly it's like, nope, we'll unite. And Muslims don't lose Jerusalem up until 1900, since then.
Is that correct?
Oh yeah. Yes?
Is this before or after when it, like when they say the golden age of Islam?
It's during this time.
During this time or the after?
During this time still. It's from typically, depending on which historian you're talking about 750 to 1250. And we're well within that range right now.
Is that where they were united or was that?
Oh, Europe hasn't been enlightened.
No, the Muslim. The Muslim.
No, they'll be within the division, and that's what I'm saying. When we say golden age, politically it wasn't the golden age many times in this, but culturally it was. That even when the Ummah is divided, they can still produce amazing works of culture, of literature, of architecture, and all this. That is all happening while they were divided. Militarily, when do they only come together? When there's like a big threat that they have to fight against.
Very cool.
Cool. With that, we'll end. وَالْعَصْرِ إِنَّ الْإِنسَانَ لَفِي خُسْرٍ إِلَّا الَّذِينَ آمَنُوا وَعَمِلُوا الصَّالِحَاتِ وَتَوَاصَوْا بِالْحَقِّ وَتَوَاصَوْا بِالصَّبْرِ. I'll go over the rest of the Crusades that we missed, 4, 5, and 6, inshallah, from the Christian perspective next week. And then we'll get into what are the lasting impacts of the Crusades, inshallah. Assalamu alaikum. We have delayed Maghrib a lot, so we're going to go right into prayer.
Who's gonna press the button?
Press the button for me.
Sounds like you want to do it.
Oh, no.